1950s. And this was a time when kids from age 5 on could just go out and play. You didn't have to have adults guiding you. You could just go outdoors and there would be other kids playing. That was a normal time. If you look throughout the world and you look throughout history, children always played with other kids, generally with no adults around. Ever since about 1955, there's been a continuous decline, according to Chudikoff and according to various social scientists who studied this in a variety of ways. There's been a continuous decline. The decline has somewhat accelerated in the last couple of decades, but it's really been continuous. Every 10 years, children are less free to go out and play and explore on their own than they were the previous 10 years. Over this, and I might say, I'm not going to talk in any great degree about why this is true, but, it's not hard to guess, or, there's a lot of intertwined reasons. But one of them has been the gradual increase in fears that we have about the dangers of outdoors. Experts are always warning us about the dangers. The media play up anytime some child somewhere gets abducted or some terrible thing happens to a child. We all hear about it, so we think it's much more common than it really is. We've kind of lost our common sense about parenting. We look to experts. We look to the media instead of just learning about parenting from our own parents or our grandparents as we used to. We often grow up not taking care of kids, not knowing much about kids, and so we kind of think kids are fragile. And it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we have to keep protecting children. That's part of it. Another part of it is the increased weight of schooling, and I really mean that word weight. Schooling has become a huge weight on children and on families. When I was a kid in the 1950s, of course we had school, and school was 6 hours long, much like it is today. But the school year, the average school year in the 1950s was 5 weeks shorter than the school year today. One of the schools at least that I went to in Minnesota, we had 6-hour school days, but 2 of those hours were outdoors. We had a half-hour recess in the morning, a half-hour recess in the afternoon, a full hour at lunch. I remember we were really never in the classroom more than an hour at a time. There was not the expectation that children are supposed to be sitting in their seats for hours and hours a day. There was no such thing as homework in elementary school at that time. Maybe once in a while the teacher would ask us to write a story or something like that and bring it in, but there were never worksheets to take home, certainly not in elementary school. There was some in high school, but not to the degree of today. We didn't have all these AP classes. We didn't have all these honors classes where you had to really get into this really competitive mode and try to spend hours a night, as many young people do today, believing you've got to do all that stuff or somehow your life is going to come to an end. So the weight of schooling has really, really changed. And moreover, we've developed what I call a kind of schoolish view of child raising. We've come to believe that somehow children are better off if there's an adult directing them and teaching them, that it's better to send them out to an adult-directed sport rather than to just send them outdoors and to play on their own. So these are changes that have occurred in our society. There's probably a lot of interconnected sociological reasons for these changes, but what I'm going to suggest here is these changes are tragic. These changes have created what is really an abnormal situation for children. Children are designed to play and explore on their own. They're designed to learn the basic things that we all have to learn in order to grow up. They're designed to do these things away from adults because that's where children have the opportunity to be the adults, to be the ones who take control of their own lives, learn how to solve their own problems, and so on. Now, over this same 60-year period that we've seen a decline in play, we have seen an equally dramatic increase in all sorts of mental disorders in childhood. It's not just that we are diagnosing disorders that we didn't look for before. But even by standard clinical questionnaires that have been given in normative groups in unchanged form over the years, we see dramatic increases. So for example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory has a depression scale in it, and there's a version of this for adolescents. Been given since about 1945. Ever since the late 1950s, when this is given to normative groups, the degree of depression goes up, such that if you were to look at what the cutoff on that scale would be for what would today be diagnosed, or likely would be suspected major depression, something like 5 to 8 times as many, something like 5 to 8 times the rate of major depression exists among young people today, both high school age students and college age students, as was true in the 1950s. And this has been a gradual change. Similarly, there's another clinical questionnaire, Taylor's Manifest Anxiety Scale, which has been given in unchanged form since the 1950s. Similarly, the rate of what would be called a clinically significant anxiety disorder is something like 7 or 8 times today for young people what it was before. The suicide rate is about 4 times today for children under age 15. It's about double for young people between about 15 and 24. For older people, the suicide rate has actually gone down. For people my age, the suicide rate has plummeted compared to what it used to be. We've become a better world in some ways, apparently, for old people, a worse world for children. So, there's another questionnaire which I think is quite significant, the results of this. There's a questionnaire called Rotter's Internal-External Locus of Control Scale, which is, and there's a version of this for adolescents. And this has been given to normative groups of adolescents since about 1960. And ever since it's been given, what this questionnaire shows is that there's been a decline in what's called an internal sense of control and an increase in what's called an external sense of control. Internal sense of control means I believe I can control my own fate. I believe I'm in charge of my own life. External sense of control means I believe I'm kind of a victim of situations around me, of other people's decisions, of events that I can't control. So over this period of time, from about 1960 until now, people have been gradually losing the sense that they control their own lives. You know, this runs contrary to what one would think would happen. In many ways, you would think we have a lot more control over our lives today than people did in the 1960s and earlier than that. We don't have quite the same degree of prejudices that we had then that limited what various people could do. Women are far more free to run their own life, make their own decisions than was true then. African Americans are certainly more free to make choices about where they live and what they do than was true then. We've learned to control diseases that we couldn't control then. So isn't it interesting? And this is across genders, this is across races, this is across social groups. Children are growing up with less of a sense that they have control over their own life than was true in the past. Not surprising. If we're not allowing them to grow up controlling their own life, if we're controlling them, if we're always putting them in adult-directed activities, if their whole life is in school and then in adult-directed things outside of school, they're not allowed to just go out and explore and get lost and learn how to solve their own problems and find their way home. They're not allowed to deal with bullies in their own ways and learn how to overcome it. They're not allowed to do all these things that children have always done in the past. Of course they're not going to learn that they have an ability to control their own lives. Now what's interesting about this is one of the things that clinical psychologists know about lack of this sense of control over your own life is that sets you up for anxiety and depression. People who don't have this internal sense of control are far more likely at some point in their life to become depressed or to become anxious than people who do have that kind of a sense of control. There has also a little more bad news. There's also questionnaires that have been designed to assess narcissism. These have been used since about 1970. And ever since these have been used, narcissism has increased in young people. And there's another questionnaire that assesses empathy, and empathy has been decreasing. It's not dramatic decreases, but it's but it's significant decreases. And when you're looking at this at the whole scale of significant decreases, well, I'm going to argue that all of these things are exactly what you would expect to happen when we deprive children of the opportunity to play and explore. You can't be a narcissist in play. Your playmates won't allow it. You can be a narcissist with your own parents. They may even encourage you. They maybe even tell you how wonderful you are. Maybe to your parents and the grandparents, you are the center of the universe, but you're never that with your playmates. Your playmates don't allow you to be a narcissist. And to play, you have to get into the minds of your playmates. You have to understand what they're doing. You have to empathize, because otherwise they won't play with you. And so what I'm suggesting is that we've seen a suite of psychological changes in young people that are depressing to look at. And I'm arguing, and I argue in my book, that we are seeing these primarily because we're not allowing children to play and explore as they once did. One other change that has been documented actually fairly recently, believe it or not, there's actually a standardized way of assessing creativity. And Torrance's test of creativity. At first I was suspicious, can you actually test creativity? But it turns out that Torrance's tests of creativity have been given to school-age children for decades now. And there's research that shows that a high score on these tests of creativity is the best predictor that we have of any kind of tests that we can give to children, the best predictor that we have of their future achievement if we measure achievement in terms of actual creative production as an adult. So people who score high on this when they're children, on this test of creativity, are more likely to do creative things, start new businesses, make inventions, write novels or plays, and so on and so forth than people who don't. It's a better predictor of real life achievement in terms of creative addition to the culture, better predictor than anything else we have, better than IQ, better than grade point average, better than teachers' guesses at who's going to be, or peer nominations of who's going to be successful in life. It's apparently, according to the people who did this research, the best measure that we have of future achievement. Well, and we've always, as a nation, we've always prided ourselves for our creativity, our innovation. We are the nation of innovators. It's sad to see that, therefore, that ever since 1984, according to people who've been doing this research, creativity has been going down among school children of all ages. K through 12, creativity is going down by these measures. Again, I argue, this is because we're not allowing children to play and explore. You can't teach creativity, but you can drive it out of people. And we are driving it out of people. With our methods of schooling now, where children really can't be creative in the classroom, they're studying for tests, that's their job, that's the least creative thing you can possibly be doing. And more, that's how we are assessing childhood. It's how well you do on those tests, which are anything but creative. We are not allowing children to go out and be creative. We are drilling creativity out of children. So let me, of course, what I've described is a correlation. Play has gone down, mental disorders have gone up, creativity has gone down, narcissism has gone up. These are all correlations. The correlation doesn't necessarily prove cause and effect. One could think about other possible causes. In my book, I kind of run through some of the other possible causes, and I suggest and I argue why they don't exactly work. So, for example, some people might say that depression is up because the divorce rate is up. But the divorce rate peaked in the 1970s, and this rise in depression has continued with at least as much steam ever since then. Moreover, there is not evidence that children in divorced families there's a temporary period of depression, but there's not evidence that their children, that they are in any kind of long-term sense more depressed. There's certainly no evidence that they're more depressed than in families where the husband and wife are unhappy but stay together, as would have been more likely in the 1950s. So that argument doesn't work particularly well, nor do many of the other arguments that people suggest for these changes these rises in, especially in depression and anxiety. What I'm going to argue as I go on in this talk is that all of these changes that I've just described are exactly what, if you know what play is, if you know what children learn through play, if you even just think about the nature of play, these are exactly the changes that you would expect to see if we deprive children of free play. You can't do experiments with children. You can't raise take a group of children and allow them full opportunity to play, another group of children will deliberately deprive them of play. You can do this, interestingly, with laboratory animals, and it has been done. Years ago, there were researchers who were doing this with monkeys. You would raise some monkeys just with adults, and they would socialize with the adults, and other monkeys just with adults, but they had at least some opportunity to play with other young monkeys. And the result of that experiment was that the young monkeys who had no opportunity to play grew up really emotionally and socially crippled. If you put them into a novel environment, they would freeze in the corner. They wouldn't explore the environment the way a normally reared monkey was. Even just a certain amount of play, just a certain amount of opportunity to play with other young monkeys caused them to behave much more normally when they were grown up. There are similar experiments nowadays with rats. There are ways of depriving, in fact, there are even ways of depriving rats of play without depriving them of the ability to interact with other young rats. An interesting way they do this, they have one group of rats that are raised with adult rats and with normal other young rats. And these are the rats that are growing up with the opportunity to play with other young rats. You have another group of rats that are being raised in this way. The experimental rat is raised with adults and with other young rats, but the other young rats are given a drug that knocks out play. It doesn't knock out other social behaviors, but it knocks out play. So, and it's interesting to note what this drug is. It's the same drug we give to kids with ADHD. With rats, it knocks out play. And these experiments, when you do these experiments, the ones that have not had this opportunity to play, because they've been raised with non-playful rats, behave in extraordinarily abnormal ways. In the ways that along the lines of what I've just described are happening with our children, but much more extreme, because these animals are being more deprived of play. So they they panic in novel situations. They act depressed in various other situations. They don't know how to get along with peers. They lash out with uncontrollable aggression, or else they cower in the corner or alternate between the two. So now let me go to really the main part of the talk here. What exactly is play and why is it such a powerful vehicle for learning? And I'm going to define play, but first let me just introduce the topic of play with just I'm checking my time here to see how fast I go, to see with a number of comments. The first, play, when you try to think about what it really is, the more deeply you try to think about it, the more you realize how many paradoxes there are about play. You know, play is serious. Watch any kids play and they're serious, and yet it's not serious. Play is trivial because it doesn't counter anything, it doesn't go on a resume, it doesn't get you anything in any immediate sense, and yet it's profound in terms of its developmental effects. Play is imaginative and spontaneous, but I'm going to argue that play always has rules. The child freely chooses to play, but in choosing to play, the child is deliberately putting herself or himself into a situation where there are rules that have to be followed. Play is not real. It takes place in a fantasy world, yet it is about the real world, and it helps children learn how to deal with the real world. Play is childish, yet I'm going to suggest that it underlies the greatest achievements of adults. From a biological perspective, which is my perspective, we could say that play is the means by which young mammals, especially our young mammals, our children, practice the skills that they need to practice to grow into effective adults. From a religious perspective, we might say that play is God's gift that makes life on earth worthwhile. Without play, life would be pretty depressing. And it's not surprising that depression is increasing among children as we deprive them of play. Wherever children are free to play, they play in certain universal ways. And it's interesting to note that the ways they play can be mapped on to the kinds of skills that children everywhere need to develop. So everywhere that children are free to play, we see physical play, physical locomotor play. This is the kind of play we share with other mammals. Climbing trees, swinging, chasing one another around, rough and tumble play. We all have physical bodies, just like other animals do. And this is how children develop their physical bodies. This is how they develop good heart and lungs and graceful movement and strong muscles. Children are not designed to run laps or lift weights. Even I hate to do those things. Children are designed to chase one another around until their sides are splitting. And when we prevent them from doing that, they become obese. They become out of shape. We don't have to encourage them to do those things. All we have to do is allow them to do those things. We have to provide the conditions in which they can do those things. We've deprived our children of the conditions in which they can do those things. There's linguistic play. We are the animal that talks. And how do we learn to talk? We learn to talk in play. If you've had a baby, you know that all that initial cooing and babbling was always playful. It was when the child was happy and it was playful mood. The first words are always playful. They're not really used to ask for anything. They're just using a playful mode. As children get a little bit older, they play with words. They play with riddles. They turn sentences around. They use grammar deliberately in alternative ways. They become little poets. And they are practicing linguistic constructions in their verbal play, even sometimes alone, but often with other children. There's constructive play. We're the animal with opposable thumbs. We're the animal that lives by building things, building our environment, building means of conveying ourselves around, building tools, and so on. And so everywhere that children are free to play, they play. And one of the ways they play is in constructive play. They construct different things depending upon the culture in which they are growing up. There's imaginative fantasy play, what researchers call sociodramatic play, when there's a number of children involved, whether it's playing house or playing superheroes, playing princess, playing whatever it is you're playing. You're imagining that you're somebody who you aren't. And you are developing with your playmates this scene. This is a very common kind of play for especially 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, but can continue on to older ages too. And I'm going to argue that imagination is the key to higher order thought, and that children are practicing this higher order thought in imaginative play. And every culture has games with formal rules. In our culture, because we're a competitive culture, these games with formal rules tend to be competitive games, things like Candyland or chess or baseball. In some other cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, which I've looked into, they also have games with formal rules. They're not competitive cultures. These are more cooperative cultures, and the games are more dance-like and trying to keep the ball going and so on and so forth. But they are still guided by very formal rules. You have to follow the rule. You're doing it in a certain deliberate way. The rules are stateable. The rules are very clear and explicit in these formal games. But we human beings, unlike other animals, are human beings that live, no matter what culture we live in. We live under rules. We make rules, whether they're explicit or implicit. There are rules that we need to follow, and children are practicing the ability to follow rules when they're playing games with explicit rules. So all of these are different ways that children play, and they show how play maps on to the kinds of skills that children everywhere need to develop. But that still doesn't define play. You can have two people throwing a ball back and forth, and you could say in one case they're playing, in another case they're not. So what really is the defining characteristic of play? What makes an activity play? So if you look at the handout, we're now on Roman numeral 2b, defining characteristics of play. I've listed 5 characteristics of play, and what I'm going to argue here is that to the degree that an activity has all of these 5 characteristics, to that degree it's pure play. Play isn't necessarily all or none. An activity can be more or less playful to the degree that it has these characteristics. So the first characteristic I've listed is play is self-chosen and self-directed. That's probably the most important characteristic. It's something that is voluntary. It's something that the child has chosen to do. It's not something that anybody has told the child to do. Play is self-directed. Play is not necessarily always accompanied by smiling and laughter. It can be very serious looking. But it is always accompanied by the sense of, yes, this is what I want to be doing right now. Self-chosen. As soon as an adult tells you to do it, as soon as if it's happening in school and the teacher says, okay, we're all going to play this now, not play because somebody else is telling you to do it rather than you yourself making that decision to do it and organizing it yourself. So play is self-chosen and self-directed. Children not only choose to play, but they choose how to play. They make their own rules, or at least they adopt the rules, they accept the rules. And this is very interesting. When children are playing together, they have to direct it together. They have to decide together what they're going to play, and they have to decide together how they're going to play. And if you've ever watched children playing together, whether it's little children playing princess and going to the ball or whatever it is, or playing superheroes, or whether it is a pickup game of baseball, whatever it is, there's an enormous amount of negotiation that goes on in play. What is it that we're going to play? And I want to play this, and you want to play that, but okay, let's play this. And then who gets to, we're playing going to the ball, or little girls playing or going to the ball, who gets to wear this nice necklace, and who gets to use that scarf? And there's all kinds of discussion and negotiation, problem solving going on. Really important social skills being developed, precisely because there's no adult there who's telling the children, oh, you're going to use this and you're going to use that. The children are figuring it out themselves. And they realize that they can't just hog. The child who may be a little stronger, who theoretically could hog everything, realizes I can't do that, because if I do, the others are just going to leave. There's nothing more that I want to do than play with you. But I know, because I've had experience with that, that if I try to be completely bossy and I try to get my way all the time, you are going to leave. So in social play, children have to negotiate. They have to see from the other person's point of view. And that's how children overcome narcissism. That's how children learn to be empathic. That's how children learn to look into the other person and see what their needs are. Probably the most important skill we human beings develop. You can live a happy enough life in our culture without knowing how to read or write or do arithmetic. But you can't live a happy life in any culture, in any human culture, if you can't empathize with other people, if you can't get into another person's head and know what they want and need and be able to provide those wants and needs. You can't have a happy marriage if you can't do that. You can't have good workmates if you can't do that. And it's not surprising to me, therefore, that children all over the world come into the world with this incredible drive to play socially. And what are they doing in playing socially? They're learning how to see from another person's point of view so that they can play with that person. So think about the difference between, let's say, a pickup game of baseball, the way all kids played baseball when I was a kid. There was hardly any Little League. There was a little bit of Little League, and a few people did that. But we all went out and played baseball. We just went out to the field and played baseball. So there'd be a bunch of kids out there, different ages, different sizes, different strengths. Somebody would have brought a ball. Somebody would have brought a bat. There was no manicured field. We'd have to figure out how to concoct the field. We'd have to figure out the rules. We'd have to make rules about how the stronger players had to self-handicap. Maybe they had to bat with, the right-handed batter would have to bat just with his left hand, maybe just using a broomstick. You'd work this all out. There'd be this whole negotiation about it. So what are the kids learning in that game? They're learning things far more important than baseball. They're learning how to create rules. They're learning how to take initiative. They're learning how to solve problems. They're learning how to get along with people. Baseball is the least important thing they're learning, even if baseball is the real reason why they're there in terms of their conscious mind. You take that away and you have adult coaches. You have umpires doing all the solving. And now, all right, this is a good enough place to learn baseball, good place to learn to throw a curveball, good place to learn how to slide into second base. But you're not learning any of this other stuff that play is designed to teach you, because adults are doing it all for you. Second characteristic of play, play is motivated by means more than ends. In play, we value our actions more than the results of our actions. Many of the activities that we do every day are things that we are choosing to do in a certain sense. We could say that nobody is making us do it. But in another sense, we feel compelled to do it. We feel compelled to do it because of the reward we get for it, because we are getting something that we feel we need, or we're getting away from something that we feel we need to get away from. So we scratch an itch to get rid of an itch. We flee from a tiger to avoid being eaten by a tiger. We read a boring book to get a good grade on a test. We work at a boring job in order to get a paycheck. None of these are play. They're self-chosen in certain sense. We could not do them if we wanted to, but we would feel that we would suffer consequences if we didn't. None of those things are play. When we are doing things for the end, we take the shortest and quickest, most efficient means to achieve that end. And that's the opposite of what we do when we play. In play, this is reversed. In play, we don't care much about the end. There may be an end that we're working to, but we are primarily interested in the means. It's the activity itself. So one way to think about this is to think about the difference between a cat that is preying on a mouse, which is not play, and a cat that is playing at preying on a mouse. The cat that is actually preying on a mouse takes the quickest, most efficient way of capturing and killing the mouse. It's the joy of eating the mouse that is the pleasure to that cat. Think now of a cat that you've probably all seen this, playing at preying on a mouse. The cat creeps up on the mouse, not necessarily in the most efficient way, grabs the mouse, lets it go, chases it again, captures it again, lets it go, captures it again. Not always in the most, oftentimes trying different means. That's the difference between play and non-play. The non-playing cat that's preying on the mouse, it's the end that is the goal. The playing cat, the mouse is a toy. The mouse is just something it's the activity of catching the mouse that is the pleasure for that cat. Play may have goals. It often does have goals. But the goals are not seen as the main purpose of the play. The goal is embedded within the play, and it's not even valued outside of the context of the play. So, for example, constructive play has a goal. Children building a sandcastle have a goal of building a sandcastle. They want to build a beautiful sandcastle. But it's not the having of the sandcastle that's important to them. Sandcastle is just going to be washed into the sea anyway. It's the building of the sandcastle. It's the feeling, I am doing this. It's the pleasure of doing it. If an adult came along and said, you can stop all your hard work on the sandcastle, I'll build it for you, the children would not be happy to hear that. And that's why we know that's play, because it's the activity itself. Similarly, children playing a competitive game, those pickup baseball games that we used to play. We're trying to win. You're trying to win, but it's not the status of having one. It's the activity of hitting the home run. It's the activity of scoring. Whenever your team scores a point, if it's real play, you may cheer wildly, but in the end, everybody forgets the score anyway. And it doesn't matter what the score is, because there's no adults watching, there's nobody cheering you on, there's no trophies to be given. It's just all for fun. As soon as you bring in trophies, as soon as you bring in adults who care about winning or losing, no matter how many times they say it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's clear from their behavior they care whether you win or lose, and no kid misses that. So we change what would be otherwise just a fun, enjoyable activity into a competition that no longer is play, because now the goal is to win. The goal is to get that trophy, to win the championship, to win the applause of the people on the sidelines, to win the praise of your parents or whoever it is that's sitting there cheering you on. Rewards can undermine play. There are many experiments along this line, but the classic one was done many years ago by researchers in California who they did this study with children in a kindergarten. And they observed that these children in the kindergarten enjoyed playing with magic markers, drawing with felt tip pens. Practically all the children liked when they had free time, which they had most of the time in those days. They would play with felt tip pens. So they did a little experiment. They took half the children and put them in a situation where they were rewarded just once for playing with felt tip pens. And the others, they put them in a similar situation but no reward. The way they did this is they said, we're going to have a visitor into the classroom, and it would be really great if you would draw a picture with felt tip pens for this visitor. For the experimental group, they said, and if you draw a picture, we will give you this beautiful good player certificate. And all the children really wanted that certificate. They drew the picture, got the certificate. In the other situation, they were just told, we're having a visitor, it'd be nice if you drew a picture for them. The kids all drew a picture just because they wanted to draw a picture, but nothing was said about any kind of reward for doing it, and they didn't get a reward for it. What the researchers observed after that is the kids who had been rewarded for drawing with felt tip pens subsequently played less with felt tip pens than they did before. The kids who had drawn a picture for the visitor but were not rewarded didn't show any drop-off in their play with felt tip pens. And that was actually the result they predicted, but they also found something else that was not predicted, but has since been replicated in other experiments too. The ones that were rewarded for drawing a picture with felt tip pens drew worse pictures than the ones who were not rewarded. Why? Because nothing was said about it having to be a good picture to get the reward. And if you're doing it for the reward, you do the minimal that you have to do to get the reward. What you do when you say you're going to get a reward for something is you turn the activity into something that in the person's mind is now work. I'm not doing this because I love doing it. I'm doing it to get the reward. That means I'm going to do it in the least effortful way that I have to get the reward. When you're just doing it with no reward, you say, I'm doing that. I must be doing this because it's fun. You're putting in, and if it's fun, you're putting some effort into it. You're trying to make a good picture for the joy of making a good picture. Well, think about this experiment as it applies to school. We reward children for everything. We use rewards and punishments as our motivation for everything that they do. Reading, you do for reward. Arithmetic. And then we wonder why it is that kids don't enjoy these kinds of things. We're turning what otherwise would be fun into work. Children would enjoy reading if they were just reading for the fun of it. We don't even let them enjoy reading in the summer. We tell them what they have to read, and then they have to write some report on it. Even in the summer we're doing that now. What a way to take all the fun out of reading. And then we wonder why kids don't do a lot of reading. Because we have taken what would otherwise be an enjoyable activity and we've turned it into work. We even call it work. In school we call it work. Do your work and then you can go out and play. Okay, so another characteristic of play, as I said before, is that it's guided by mental rules. Play is freely chosen activity, but it is not free-form activity. It's not random activity. It's always guided by rules. That's true for all the kinds of play that I mentioned before. So, for example, rough and tumble play. Imagine two boys chasing one another around the house and rough and tumbling, play fighting, wrestling on the floor. The difference between a play fight and a real fight is the real fight doesn't have any rules. Anything goes. The goal is to just hurt the other person and drive the other person away. The play fight, of course, the goal is the opposite of driving the other person away. The goal is to keep the game going. The goal is to act like you're hurting the other person, but not really hurt the other person. So the play fight, we think of some people confuse play fighting with real fighting, but it's actually the opposite of real fighting. It's two, usually boys, also I'll say boys, but it can be girls. In hunter-gatherer cultures, it's often girls play fighting too. But the but it's this activity of being in close contact, going through the motions of fighting while restraining yourself in such a way that you don't really hurt the person. You can't kick, you can't bite, you can't scratch. If you are the bigger and stronger of the two, you have to self-handicap in various ways. If you're going to throw the other person, you throw them onto a leaf pile or onto a couch in some way. It's very bound by implicit rules. It's an exercise in self-control, and all play is exercise in self-control. In constructive play, the rule is that you are using your chosen medium to build the thing that you have in mind. You've got something in your mind that you're trying to produce. You're consciously controlling your behavior towards a certain end. In sociodramatic play, of course, children playing superheroes or whatever it is, the rule is to be in character. You have to be the person that you claim you are being. If you are Wonder Woman, you have to behave like Wonder Woman. If you fall down and hurt yourself and you believe that Wonder Woman doesn't cry, you don't cry, even if you've fallen down and hurt yourself. If you do cry, that you know implicitly that means time out. You're not Wonder Woman right now. So what are children practicing here? They're practicing the art of controlling themselves, the art of behaving in accordance with an implicit set of rules, of socially agreed upon rules of how you are supposed to behave if you are that kind of a person. And one of the things that distinguish us from other animals is we couldn't have human society if we didn't play roles. I'm playing the role of lecturer right now, and you're playing the role of audience. There's certain things that I could not do right now, or it would just destroy the whole thing. Certain things you could not do right now. We know how to play roles. We practice that, and children are practicing that all the time. They're learning to control their impulses, their instincts. They're learning to guide their behavior in accordance with a socially agreed upon set of rules. The great Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky was the person who first, at least as far as I know, wrote about this. He gave an example that I think is worth quoting. He describes watching two sisters who in real life were sisters, little girls who would sometimes play that they were sisters. And when they were really sisters, there was no particular rule about how they interacted with one another. Sometimes usually they would ignore one another, sometimes they would interact pleasantly with one another, sometimes they would fight with one another. But when they were playing that they were sisters, they behaved in a certain very clear stereotyped way, representing a particular stereotyped view of what it means to be sisters. They would dress the same, they would walk with their arms around one another, they would love one another, they would hate everybody else, and that was what it meant to be sisters. And so I once tried, when my son was little, and I would try to get him to behave, I would say, let's pretend that I'm the daddy and you're the little boy. And it worked about 5 times, and then he said, let's pretend that I'm the daddy. So you might get away with that for a little while. So the fourth characteristic of play that I have on the list here is that play is imaginative. All forms of play involve at least some degree of imagination or fantasy. It's most obvious in sociodramatic play. You're pretending that you're Wonder Woman. You're pretending that the couch is a magic bridge and there's a troll under it or whatever it is. You're setting up an imagined scene. But rough and tumble play is imaginative too. It's a pretend play. It isn't a real play. Constructive play is imaginative. It's a pretend castle. It's not a real castle. You call it a real castle as you're building it, but at another level, you know it's a pretend castle. Formal games with explicit rules. Let's say take the game of chess. You're entering into a particular imagined situation, a situation where bishops can only move on the diagonal, for example. In real life, bishops can go wherever they want, but in chess, they can only move on the diagonal. You're entering into an imaginary world where certain conditions apply, and you're learning how to think and deal in this imaginary world. And what I would suggest is that all higher order human thought involves entering into an imaginary world in a certain sense. You're thinking about things. The thing that distinguishes human thought from that of other animals is we can think about things that aren't right in front of us. We can think about tomorrow. And whenever we do that, it's an act of imagination. We're thinking about what could happen tomorrow. And then we're thinking about the consequences. If this happens, then what might else happen? The kinds of activities that we greatly admire, the kinds of mental activities that we greatly admire, all involve imagination. Architect designing a new building is first designing that building in her imagination. She's imagining this building, how it might be used, who might go through it, what would be the flow of activity. It's all imagination. And then she might draw it out on paper. It's a playhouse. At first it's an imagined house, then it's a playhouse before it becomes a real house. Scientists, whenever they try to think of some explanation for the phenomena that they are observing, are using imagination. Gravity is a pure construct of imagination. You can't see gravity. It's just an imagined entity that has good explanatory power. Geniuses often seem to be those who somehow retain into adulthood the imaginative capacities of small children. Einstein was fond of saying that all of his achievements in mathematics and theoretical physics were what he called combinatorial play. He famously described his thought about relativity as coming from, at least partly, from imagining himself chasing a sunbeam and imagining what would happen if he caught up to that sunbeam. So imagination, I'm arguing, underlies all higher order thought, and children are constantly practicing the use of imagination in play. Fifth characteristic of play is that it is conducted in an active, alert, but non-stressed frame of mind. And this characteristic follows from the other characteristics. You can't play passively because you've got these rules you've got to attend to. You're attending to the means. You're doing this because you want to do it. So you're fully involved. Your mind is very active in it, but at the same time, you're not being evaluated. Nobody's given any trophies for it. Nobody's getting any demerits for their failure. There's no such thing as any kind of real-world immediate consequences for it, so you're free to fail. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work out, so you're not stressed. You might be putting yourself into a somewhat stressful situation. Climbing a tree can be an act of play. You deliberately climb high enough and you experience a certain amount of fear. But if you experience too much fear, it becomes too stressful, then you've got to climb down the tree. Just as you're always free to enter play, you're always free to leave it. You're always free to quit. And because you could quit, you're never going to be in a situation where you feel traumatized by play. So play occurs with this mental state of an active mental state, but not as highly stressed mental state. And there's a great deal of research that shows that this is exactly the kind of mental state that is best for learning, that is best for creative activities, that is best for solving novel problems. I could go on and describe many such experiments. Because I'm kind of running out of time, I'm going to cut off the last part of this talk, but let me describe just a couple of experiments that have to do with the value of a playful state of mind in problem solving. So there's a researcher named Alice Eisen, used to be at Cornell. I think she's retired now. But she did many, many experiments in which she would put some of her research subjects in what she called a good mood. But when I look at her experiments, I would say what she was really doing was she was putting them in something more specific than a good mood. She was putting them in a playful mood. So one of her experiments made use of a problem that's called the candle problem. It's a classic insight problem where you as the subject are given a small candle, a box of tacks, a book of matches, and there's a bulletin board in the room, and you're told your job is to mount the candle on the bulletin board in such a way that you can light it and it will burn effectively. This is a problem that's been used since the 1930s as a classic insight problem. The actual solution to the problem that most people don't get in the usual situation is that you dump the tacks out of the tack box and then tack the box to the to the bulletin board to create a shelf, and then you mount the candle on this shelf. When you give this problem in a sort of serious way, like this is a test, and you give it to college students, even at Cornell or other Ivy League schools, only about 15% of the people that you give this to are able to solve the problem. She found that if she preceded the problem by having the subjects watch for 5 minutes a clip from a slapstick comedy, and then she had them solve the problem, 75% solved the problem. The comedy had nothing to do with candles or anything like that. It didn't give any clues away. All it did was, in her mind, put them in a good mood. In my mind, put them in a playful mood. If you are in a playful mood, it's easy to think of one thing standing for another. That's what play is all about. Easily, in play, a tack box can become a shelf, just as a stick can become a horse, and so on and so forth. Play allows you to think outside of the box. You know, when we were being given candy, I was thinking of another experiment that this same researcher did, this time with actual physicians as her subjects. And what she did was she took to these physicians a difficult case to diagnose. It involved, the actual diagnosis was some kind of a liver disease, but there were some trip-ups in the case story that would lead to some false ways of thinking. So it was kind of a difficult case to solve, but it had a clear solution if you were apparently if you were knowledgeable about this liver disease, and presumably these physicians were. In half the cases, she gave the physicians a little bag of candy before asking them to solve the problem. And this was to put them in a good mood. I would say this puts them in a playful mood. I mean, a little bag of candy is not a huge reward for physicians, right? I mean, you're not going to, but it makes you think, oh, we're like children here. This is like a game. This is fun. And so it changes the mental set from this is a serious test to this is kind of fun. And what she found was, in the case where the physicians were given a little box of candy, they were more likely to solve the problem, significantly more likely to solve the problem, less likely to get distracted by misleading information. So she and others have done many such experiments. We think better when we are in a playful mood, especially when we are thinking about things that are not solvable through some easy algorithm, through step A, step B, step C, step D. All you have to do is remember the steps and do it, but that requires some kind of creative thought. Increasingly now, we are in a world where all the jobs are going to require creative thought. They all require innovation. We've got computers to do the algorithms. We've got robots to do the routine work. We've got Google to look up the facts. There's no point in schooling teaching us a whole lot of facts or teaching us algorithms. The whole point of education should be discovering what you want to do, learning how to be creative, learning how to think ahead, learning how to get along with other people. These are all the things that we learn in play, and these are all the things that are suppressed in school. And because I'm running out of time, I'm going to bring it to a close now. And thank you all very, very much for your